Shortages in the stores, and what is left costs even more. When will our broken supply chains be repaired? From toys for children to automobiles for adults, a seaside view of goods moving through America's port.
The Port of LA is the largest container port in the Western Hemisphere. It encompasses 7,500 acres of property, 43 miles of waterway, and the cargo that traverses this port reach each and every one of our 435 congressional districts.
Now, on the Inside Story, broken supply chains.
Hi, I'm VOA correspondent Elizabeth Lee at the Port of Los Angeles in Southern California. More goods flow into and out of this port than any other in the United States, which makes it the perfect place to start a deep dive into how the world's broken supply chains are being repaired. We'll get back to the port in a few minutes. First, the COVID pandemic exposed stress points in how goods are manufactured, packaged, shipped, received, unpacked, and delivered to other destinations around the world. With the global supply chain already stressed, recent developments are making things worse. Outbreaks in China, a main global manufacturing hub, and its zero COVID strategy mean lockdowns in parts of the country. Plus another global crisis, Russia's war against Ukraine and the economic sanctions it brings. I traveled to Rocky Point Creamery and Farm in Frederick County, Maryland, to see how these global events bring a new set of disruptions for consumers. Farming isn't easy. Like all farmers, Chuck Fry is at the mercy of the weather, but he never expected to have problems due to a pandemic and now a war in Ukraine.
The global supply chain at farm level is a disaster.
Fry is a dairy farmer, but he also grows crops, including barley and alfalfa. Most of it goes to feeding his cows. This planting season, the cost of doing business has skyrocketed.
Fertilizer has almost tripled from last year.
Fry used to pay around $330 for just over 900 kilograms of fertilizer. This year, it's more than $800. The problem started when the pandemic disrupted production and shipping. Then Russia, which produces many fertilizer ingredients, invaded Ukraine. That triggered more shipping disruptions, panic buying, hoarding, and other problems. The entire global supply chain slowed, much like highway traffic, says economist Chris Tang.
The disruptions is like someone, they step on the gas and someone step on the brake,
causing traffic jams and delays.
When you can't get from one supplier, it puts constraints on all the other ones, when there's just not enough to go around for everybody.
Fry says the price of diesel has more than doubled. His tractor holds 1,135 liters of fuel.
Oil is what puts food on the table. This tractor runs off diesel fuel. Without diesel fuel, I can't get my crops in.
Even before the most recent challenges, farmers were already experiencing disruptions in the global supply chain because of the pandemic. They say they were having a hard time finding medicines for their livestock because much of it comes from China. Container ships loaded with cargo from Asia were stacked up at U.S. ports last year. A trucker shortage further delayed deliveries of goods. More recently, COVID-19 cases have surged in China, prompting temporary lockdowns and plant closures. Disruptions at the world's largest container port in Shanghai is causing a ripple effect globally. Economist Chris Tang expects delays to continue.
In the China's production is stop and go, stop and go. Whenever they shut down, the factories are not producing anything. Then when they start again, so in that case, that creates a traffic jam, just like our freeway.
When supply decreases amid robust demand, prices increase, causing inflation.
Our worlds are all connected. So inflation in one country will also cause inflation in other country.
Like many farmers, Fry says he may have to cut back production to offset rising prices and keep the farm that has been in his family since the 1800s. Thousands of cars come through this port here in Los Angeles, from vehicles on the road to appliances in the kitchen and phones in your pocket. So much of what we use requires a semiconductor chip to operate. The pandemic already significantly affected the production of these microchips, and the economic sanctions on Russia could further impact supply. An explanation from VOA's Silicon Valley Bureau Chief, Michelle Quinn.
These devices are GPS trackers. They travel the world attached to boxes of medicines, food, and electronics, sending back information about the package's temperature, location, and whether there's been damage. And they rely on semiconductors, which are in short supply.
There's not enough that we have. The demand is so much.
The supply of computer chips, the brains of every computing device, has been tight for more than a year as the world emerges from the pandemic. Automakers, household appliance manufacturers, game consoles makers, and many others are scrambling. Some are delaying production. Others are redesigning products around the kinds of chips they can get.
We have a semiconductor in almost every single thing that you buy. So my washing machine tells me when it's ready. My dryer tells me when it's ready. My oven has a sensor. Everything that we buy has these sensors, internet connected devices. And so it's going to be impacting the normal consumer.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine could make the global chip supply problem worse. Experts say both Ukraine and Russia produce key materials used in semiconductor processing.
Some companies will have less dependency depending on their inventories, their supply chain, and how they manage it. And some companies will have greater dependency. As the war continues, it will become a greater and greater issue.
Romeby, like a lot of firms, is scouring the world for chips and stockpiling them. Doing so breaks from years of just-in-time manufacturing, the common manufacturing practice of buying components just before the product is assembled, which keeps costs low.
And there are two choices, right? Either sit and do nothing and be hopeful that things will just improve, or you basically take the bull by the horn and say, what can we basically bring in within our control?
But buying up chips may extend the crisis.
This will go on, in my opinion, for the next 12 to 18 months because companies like us and many others are going to build out that buffer inventory more than what is needed.
For consumers, costs are rising, in part because of the components shortage.
So I wouldn't be surprised if the very same electronics that we used to buy 2 years ago is now 10%, in some cases, more expensive.
The shortages have led the U.S. and European governments to consider bringing chip manufacturing back home. But that's going to take some time. Michelle Quinn, VOA News, Santa Clara, California.
More than 1,800 ships sailed through the Port of Los Angeles in 2021. It covers more than 3,000 hectares with nearly $300 billion worth of goods coming and going. Managing such an enterprise is daunting even in the best of times. I talked to the executive director of the Port of Los Angeles, Gene Soroka, about what's been done at the port to mitigate supply chain disruptions, the challenges involved, and whether things will improve anytime soon.
There are impacts across the board, whether it's subassembly, manufacturing, transport, but the amount of cargo flow, and we measure this every day, remains very consistent. In fact, this morning we've got 44 ships on the way just leaving Asia and coming across, and that's about where we've been throughout this lockdown. Now, there will be a time as those lockdown rules start to loosen up a little bit, we may see even more cargo come up as factories start to gear up back to 100% capacity. But I don't see a pure collapse with a whipsaw effect of a flood of cargo like some have predicted.
At its worst, how many ships were waiting out here?
Right. At its peak, and this is not a record to boast about, we had 109 vessels queued waiting to come into the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach in January of this year. Today, that number stands at about 35. Still much more work to do. No one's taking a victory lap. But what we did, in essence, was increase the velocity of the cargo. Back in October last year, where many observers were saying that holidays could be in jeopardy and retail sales at risk, we had more cargo sitting here for longer periods of time than ever in recorded history. Some 40% of all the containers on the docks were 9 days and older. So we did a lot of data mining, trying to segment all this cargo and see what we could do to move the needle. And in fact, it was simply the threat of a fine for long aging containers that got cargo moving into the domestic economy.
So Gina, the war in Ukraine has also caused more disruptions in the supply chain. Talk about what you're seeing at the port here.
On the ground, we see three areas that are of impact to the supply chain. One, a region that's very well known for its agriculture products and its supply to the European Union being really hampered now because of the atrocities on the ground. Who picks up the slack in this area, and how do those precious agriculture products get to the families' dinner tables throughout the EU? Second, we're watching very closely on the energy product distribution. We've seen prices on the oil market spike. We've seen some areas not being fed by their normal pathway of logistics providers. And then we've seen some political maneuvers on how to cut off certain flows of natural gas to other trading nations. This is going to be very important to watch in an industry such as liner shipping, where such a large component of cost is their fuel. The third piece comes a little closer to home here in Los Angeles, and that's the cyber threatscape. Nation states have been very active since the advent of COVID-19. Here in LA, we're stopping some 40 million cyber intrusion attempts per month, and that's double what it was before COVID-19.
Do you anticipate things to go back to pre-pandemic levels anytime soon?
No, I don't. The dislocations in the supply chain are numerous because the system is stressed. We're buying more consumer goods than ever before. As you rightly mentioned, those silicon chips that go into automobiles and cell phones have been outsourced for years and manufacturing under pressure as well. We've got to right-size the capacity of those builds in order to get to our consumer level products. The cargo volume continues almost unabated because we continue to buy here on the ground at the consumer level, even with 8.5% inflation. Our $2 trillion worth of savings in bank accounts are also helping that purchasing power, but I think that folks will be a little bit mindful of the rising cost of fuel, eggs at the grocery store, housing costs, etc. But the National Retail Federation this morning just said that first half of 2022 projections will outstrip what they had already called for in container volume. We'll see an earlier than normal peak season with landings starting at about the end of June. That'll be combined with back to school and fall fashion products as well. So hitting the mark in these early months of the year will really predict how well we can service the stronger retail season in the back half of 2022.
Among the goods that come through here, cars, trucks, and the parts that get them built and sold. Nearly 20% fewer automobiles come through the Port of LA during the 2 years of the pandemic. Car parts shipping dropped 15% in 2020, gaining back about half that much in 2021. Add the semiconductor chip shortage, and the United States has fewer new cars to supply and a customer demand that is increasing. VOA Midwest correspondent Kane Fairbaugh explains the impact on the car industry.
By this point in the year, Bill Walsh Jr. hoped to see inventory on the lots of the 27 automotive franchises he oversees back to normal.
We typically have 2,000 vehicles in stock, especially this time of year going into the spring. We're at 600.
Walsh's available inventory is down more than 65% at a time when demand for vehicles is up. Part of the problem for manufacturers is a shortage of semiconductors, or chips, needed for the electronic systems in most new vehicles. While that shortage stems from a lack of production during the pandemic, Walsh says it's been compounded by a perfect storm of circumstances since then.
You've got labor shortage problems, you've got transportation problems, you've got now natural disasters.
A shutdown of the shipping lanes in the Suez Canal for weeks in 2021 is another contributing factor. And now, the war in Ukraine.
Wire harnesses, apparently. Ukraine is one of the most important producers.
Professor Hani Mahmasani is the William A. Patterson Distinguished Chair in Transportation at Northwestern University in Illinois.
Our supply chains have become so globalized and interrelated that, if one sort of spot in there is struggling, you're going to see repercussions across the board.
Mahmasani says the automotive industry spent 20 years trying to optimize supply chains while cutting costs.
We have hyper-optimized supply chains, and that means that there's very little slack left. And when you have no slack, you're really not able to deal with disruptions very well. And so we've designed for low cost, essentially, and for efficiency. And by doing so, we have lost resilience.
And money. Avnet Silica, a division of a European company that distributes electronic components, reports that automotive manufacturers lost more than $500 billion in revenue since the start of the pandemic.
10.5 million units in lost production,
which has trickled down to dealers like Walsh.
We have seen probably 200 units a month taken out of our total sales.
Walsh says the manufacturers who supply his dealerships are warning the problems won't end anytime soon, even as they try to retool supply chains.
Depending on the manufacturer, 2023, 2024, 2025, and don't ever anticipate having the inventory levels that you've had pre-COVID.
Potential customers wait for inventory, and they will pay more once they find a vehicle they want. Not only are overall prices in the U.S. increasing, so are interest rates for auto loans amid the highest inflation figures in 40 years. Kane Fairbaugh, VOA News, Ottawa, Illinois.
When there is a longer than usual line of ships to unload their cargo here, the impact ripples throughout the country. Rail cars and trucks are waiting for goods to deliver, delaying those who have goods to send elsewhere. And it's not just big stuff like cars and computers. It goes right down to the tiny almond. VOA's Michael Sullivan went to California's Central Valley to explain the challenges facing American almond farmers.
80% of the world's almonds come from California. They are eaten as a snack and used in cooking and in popular foods such as almond milk. David Phippen is a third-generation grower. He also processes almonds for more than 120 other growers.
A good deal of our production goes to Japan. A lot of it goes to Dubai. We have some production in shell that goes into the Indian markets. And I'd say 25% of our production goes into the European markets.
Most shipments go through the port of Oakland, but there's a problem. A surge in shipments of goods from Asia has made it less profitable for ships to wait for American exports to be loaded for their return trips. At congested West Coast ports, many container ships unload their cargo, then turn around and hurry back to Asia with empty containers. It's a problem noted in Washington, where the Biden administration and some in Congress hope to strengthen federal oversight of shipping.
If we don't present the almonds to market, we can't bring payment back to the United States and pay our growers. And our growers are dependent on those payments to produce the next crop that's hanging on the trees as we speak.
Almonds can be stored for more than 2 years under the right conditions. But the industry is losing opportunities, says Richard Waycott, the head of an industry marketing and research organization.
With a food product, if you don't ship it when consumption's happening in the country that you're shipping to, for instance, Chinese New Year or the big Diwali holidays in India, etc., it doesn't get consumed.
What's really worrisome to my partners and I is that this building needs to be empty before the next harvest starts so that we can place yet another crop in here.
The harvest will start in August. Meanwhile, Phippen has bought 3,000 wooden containers to store the excess.
And this won't solve the problem, but it deals with the problem.
One local market is still intact. Farmers use the soft outer hull of the almond as feed for dairy cows and the shells for livestock bedding, a careful use of resources that's part of modern farming. The shipping problems come in the midst of a multi-year drought that has also challenged California's farmers. Mike O'Sullivan, VOA News, near Modesto, California.
The laws of supply and demand are being tested by the breaks in the supply chains. Prices go up if there isn't enough supply to meet the demand. And that is reflected by inflation rates that are up around the world. While in Los Angeles, I spoke to Shannon Sedgwick of the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation about the types of products manufactured in LA for the global market and how businesses are responding to the challenges in the supply chain.
While people don't think of manufacturing as a very large industry because it's been on a long-term decline in terms of employment since the 90s, it's still a very large industry here in Los Angeles and in California. In Los Angeles County alone, they employs over 400,000 people. And so a lot of these manufacturing firms are specifically located close to the port in order to export and have access to foreign markets. We have aerospace components that are manufactured here and sent abroad. And we have actually a significant number of high-tech products that are manufactured here too.
How do you see local manufacturing pivot or impacted by these challenges? Are they going out of business, or are they finding more regional supply chains?
Well, I think the global pandemic was a wake-up call because now being too reliant on global supply chains had a negative consequence associated with it. So you see some manufacturers try to establish and reestablish local supply lines, while some of those decisions to tap into the global supply chains might have been cost motivated. They now see the vulnerability that it placed them in when there was a disruption like a global pandemic. And so moving forward, we think that's going to be likely to persist, that they're going to make sure that they have local connections to suppliers, even if there is a higher cost associated with it, as a way of insulating moving forward. We've always been a larger importer than we have an exporter. And so, in years prior, there was a concern of how do we fill these empties going back. And so we haven't seen that same issue in exporting our goods. If anything, some of the issues took place because the number of ships in the beginning of the pandemic, there were just fewer ships sailing. And so that might have been an issue because there were fewer ships going back and forth. It's more getting things in to satisfy our massive consumer market, because there's 10 million people in Los Angeles County alone. And so California is a massive consumer market that just demands goods all the time.
Although it's just mid-May, you may want to think about doing some Christmas shopping. Supply chains are still trying to catch up with toy makers and the gift industry, but the calendar keeps moving. Another Mike O'Sullivan story about the California toy company trying to adjust to these difficult days.
Hundreds of workers assemble toys and seasonal items, most recently for Easter, using components from China. From this factory in Los Angeles, they are shipped to American retailers. The biggest is Walmart. These low-cost products rely on just-in-time shipping through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, a process now plagued with delays, says Megatoy's CEO Charlie Wu.
Sometimes you get all the products arrive except one item, and you have no idea when that arrived, and that will hold up the entire production and delivery schedule because of one piece of component.
Most troubling, he says, the supply chain is now unpredictable.
If you know it's a 2-week delay or 3 weeks delay, you can compensate it by ordering a 2 or 3 weeks early. But the difficulty with this crisis was that some products are delayed 2 or 3 weeks, some products are delayed 2 or 3 months.
And seasonal items tied to a holiday need to arrive on time.
We had Christmas product arrive after Christmas for the last 2 seasons already, and we have, Valentine product arriving in March.
Mike O'Sullivan, VOA News, Los Angeles.
That's all for now from the Port of Los Angeles. For everyone behind the scenes who produced this show, I'm Elizabeth Lee. Follow me on Twitter at EliTV1 and follow VOA News on Instagram and Facebook. Online, stay up to date at voanews.com. Thanks for being with us. See you next week for The Inside Story.